Hi, Ms. McCabe. This is my personal poetry project, and I did mine over George Morris Horton, myself. I feel myself in need of inspiring strains of ancient lore, my heart to lift, my empty mind to feed, and all the world explore. I know that I am old and never can recover what is past, but for the future may some light unfold, and soar from age's blast. I feel resolved to try, my wish to prove, my calling to pursue, or mount up from the earth into the sky, to show what heaven can do. My genius from a boy has fluttered like a bird within my heart, but cannot thus confine her powers employ, impatient to depart. She's like a restless bird, would spread her wings, her power to be unflurred, and let her song be loudly heard, and depart from world to world. And again, I feel myself in need of the inspiring strains of ancient lore, my heart to lift, my empty mind to feed, and all the world explore. I know that I am old, and never can recover what is past, but for the future may some light unfold, and soar from age's blast. I feel resolved to try, my wish to prove, my calling to pursue, or mount up from the earth to the sky, to show what heaven can do. My genius from a boy has fluttered like a bird within my heart, but cannot thus confine her powers employ, impatient to depart. She, like a restless bird, would spread her wings, her power to be unflurred, and her songs be heard loudly, and dart from world to world. About the author. George grew up as a slave in North Carolina on a tobacco plantation. While enslaved, he learned how to read and write by listening in on students near his owner's land. Around 1815, he began composing poetry in his head, and saying them aloud and selling them at the local farmers market in Chapel Hill. At the University of North Carolina, students would frequently ask George to compose a letter for their loved ones and lovers. As his fame spread, he caught the attention of a novelist and professor's wife, Coraline Lee Whiting Hens. She transcribed his poetry and posted it to the local newspaper. With her assistance, Horton published his first collection of poetry, called The Hope of Liberty, published in 1829, becoming the first African-American male to publish a book in the South, and one of the first to publicly protest his slavery in poetry. Horton hoped to earn enough money from the publication of his novel to get free of slavery, but his attempts were denied despite significant support from the members of the community and even the governor. After 68 years of slavery, George settled in Philadelphia for 17 years of freedom before his death in 1883. George's background gives each and every one of his pieces a story and a life behind it. George was noticed by his beautiful verses that he would say aloud, and wanted to let his creative mind be heard by whoever was interested. George's enslavement gave him persistence and determination to write and compose poetry that was meaningful and stood out, and made his poetry something of interest to many of the buyers that were in Chapel Hill. The reflection of his poem and the meaning behind the story. Horton named his poetry George Morris Horton, Myself, to indicate that the poem will reflect Horton's thoughts and feelings of himself and his situation. It is also a way in which he empowers himself. Even though he is enslaved, he has proclaimed his individuality and humanity. The poem discusses him being caged by slavery, but this poem, in a sense, is allowing him to transcend his enslavement. In the stanza, of the inspiring strains of ancient lore, my heart to lift, my empty mind to feed, and all the world explore. Inspiring strains of ancient lore is all of the writers of the past. He feels the need of them as he desires to learn from those that have written beautiful poetry, hence why he says empty mind to feed. As an enslaved person, he would have been forbidden to read, but with his persistence and love of learning, he made it a point to make sure that he knew how to do these things. In lines 5 and 6, I know I am old and I can't recover what is past. He's using this to show that no matter what happens to him now, he will forever have been a slave as part of who he was and how he became so creative and stuff, and he will never leave that part behind because that's what made him him. He tells the way in which slavery has limited his creativity by describing what he would and could do, but his description is hypothetical, since the message is he can't really do any of those things. He opens and closes the poem expressing his need and want to explore the world, as well as to expand the perspective and learn new experiences. He mentions wanting to pursue his calling, to show what heaven can do, implying that his creativity and art is part of God's work. While enslaved, Horton unsuccessfully tried to gain his freedom through his writing. This experience is visible within the third stanza of the poetry, when Horton states that he is resolved to try, to prove himself by pursuing his calling or pursuing his art in writing. He also states that he has had this genius since he was a boy. Restless to share his art, despite his abilities, he is still confined. This poem brings this message of the enslaved people after being freed. Though physically enslaved, Horton illustrates how he was able to maintain his individuality and express his own hopes and desires through his poetry. Enslavement may have limited his creativity, but his poetry presents a challenge to that. As this poetry was published the same year that the 13th Amendment was signed, formerly enslaved people might find it as a calling to let their creativity and individuality soar, and let her song be heard loudly. Thus, encouragement to share their positivity, experience, and thoughts and feelings to those that were enslaved. There's many literary terms described in this poetry. There's a simile in line 14 that reads, "Has fluttered like a bird within my heart." This simile compares a fluttering bird to the creativity in his heart, which makes us understand how he was feeling being enslaved with such a creative mind. And he sets the tone of beauty in his writing. Instead of just saying creative, he uses the word bird as it is a symbol of freedom. Personification is also used in this poetry. In line 3, "My empty mind to feed." Your mind is not empty, and it cannot be physically fed. To this, he is using personification. He uses this to exaggerate the need and want of learning from the past and past writers. As well as personification simile, he also uses list, which is not very common in poetry, but is unique in this poem. He uses many lists of what he feels and wants to feel, which gives the readers a true understanding of how much these ideals mean to him, and gives structure to the poetry. Throughout this poem, you see an A, C, B, D pattern. He uses this at the end of every line, comparing the first line to the third line and the second line to the fourth line, using rhyming words. In lines 9 through 12, the stanza reads, "I feel resolved to try, my wish to prove, my calling to pursue, or mount up from the earth to the sky, to see what heaven can do." He uses comparing to compare try to sky and do to pursue. In this stanza, he feels that he needs to try to pursue his dreams, as well as let others who were previously enslaved know that it's okay to take risks. And upon doing this, his opportunities seem to reach to the sky. This let the others enslaved feel it reassured that they can also do the same, and it's going to be okay if they try something new. He follows this writing style in a bunch of his other poems, which gives the reader an understanding of how he feels and how they should feel upon reading this poetry, and gives a style to his writing. Like previously talked about, symbolism is used in this poetry many of times, but the most prominent use of symbolism is whenever he talks about a bird and heaven. Bird is obviously a symbol of freedom. In this poetry, he often compares his creativity to a caged bird. Thus, since being enslaved, he feels his creativity is being held from freedom. A part of the poetry reads, "His genius has fluttered like a bird within my heart, but it is confined in slavery." George uses heaven as a sign from God. This is very powerful and makes others think and understand that God is with them always. I chose this poetry because I love the underlying meaning George gives to the poetry. The story is really up to you on how you interpret it. Obviously, I never got to live through enslavement and feeling trapped, but he shows that no matter what stands in your way, you should continue to pursue your dreams and take actions towards them, which really inspires me and makes me feel blessed, and at the same time determined to chase my dreams, because I have so many opportunities that I can constantly look past or take advantage of. This is my creative project. I did a drawing. The man in the photo is obviously George Morris Horton. There's a world right next to his head, with little music notes sticking out, because he talks in one of his lines about how he wants to have others' words be heard around the world. Above George, there is clouds with a little cross, and that represents the meaning of heaven and God that he uses in the poetry as well. I put a little cage on the side with the bird that has escaped the cage right next to him as one of the other main focal points, because it's really the whole meaning behind the poetry, and what he wanted everyone to really focus their minds on is his creativity and his need for letting go. And down at the bottom corner there is my rendition of a Tabasco plantation that he still keeps in his mind, I don't know how to draw that, so that's just what the plant's gonna be. Other than that, I think it's pretty good representation of the poetry that I read, which is Myself, and by George Morris Horton. We're excited. I did Poetry Foundation, and that's where I got all my information from. So thank you, Miss McCabe, for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.